We're very excited for this conversation today, the first Bio2Bedside that we're doing at a conference venue properly. So very excited for the conversation today. The goal here is to really develop out and have a conversation around how do we make a viable path using some of the different regulatory models that are available now through right to try legislation in Montana and even inside of Florida, with the goal here of being able to bring rare disease development and then commercialization to patients a lot less expensive. So we'll plan to get into that and have a conversation, but before we get started, let's introduce our guests.
Introduce ourselves. I don't know who wrote this slide. It was not me, but I'm the only one who actually, everything else is like co-founder, CEO, and then Jeff is like his whole life story's there. So my name's Jeff Martin. Mr. Jeffrey Martin is me. I run a company called Flight Bio. We work with early stage biotech companies to help them find and match investment firms and kind of like, make sure that we're not going to be wasting people's time. So me and Ben have been doing Bio2Bedside for almost a year now. It's we did a pretty good run of like 6 months every week, and then we got kind of busy around the holidays. But we're back. We have a lot of good plans for this year. I'm Jeff, and I'll kick it over to Ben. You can kind of do your intro.
Ben McLeod, co-founder, founder of Convey Bio. Let's kick it over to the actual experts as opposed to a guy who has a chronic LinkedIn habit. So we'll start with you, Dan.
Thanks, Ben and Jeff, for inviting me to sit on this panel. I'm Dan Gibbs. I'm the CEO of Cercium Biosciences. We're based here in San Diego. We're a manufacturing enabling technology company. We're the crazy guys who manufacture AV in tobacco plants. The reason that we
smoke them.
But the reason that we have invested time and effort into developing an orthogonal method for manufacturing the viral vectors that are used for clinical gene therapy is because of the significant cost, speed, and scalability issues with conventional manufacturing. And this is one of the most significant barriers to adoption of gene therapies because it drives a lot of the cost to the patient. So we're really looking at driving down the cost of manufacturing, the speed and the scalability of this, predominantly in the rare and ultra-rare disease space. We're agnostic to indication by at least an order of magnitude. And that then has to be passed on through the development cycle to patients to improve access. So whilst we're enabling technology to the drug developers, our entire mission is to enable much broader and much more cost-effective and safe and reproducible access to these therapies, and really to change the commercial model. So that's me. I've done a lot of AV drug development in my life in academia and industry, and it generally in CNS and ocular for rare and ultra-rare diseases.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Over to you, Craig.
I'm Craig Martin. I'm the founder and CEO of the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator. We are a nonprofit biotech, and we chose to go the nonprofit route because our focus is on identifying and obtaining the rights to shelved therapeutic assets for ultra-rare diseases, completing commercialization or completing development and commercializing those therapies so they can get to patients, many of whom are children. The tax incentive that we can offer is to write off the fair market value of that asset and up to 10 years of net sales revenue. So our hope there is to incentivize companies that may be sitting on an asset that has advanced into clinical trials, was helping patients, but didn't have the commercial value that they needed to justify continued investment, get them to contribute those programs to us, and then we have deferred and reduced cost relationships with CROs and CDMOs to complete development, and then we incentivize them based on commercialization or some value-generating event from those programs.
Yes, and Craig is not my dad, for anyone wondering. It's the same last name.
No family relation.
You couldn't have said brother or cousin or something?
Craig is not my son either, in case you're wondering.
Very good. Okay, so let's set the stage here. Last year, Montana came out with some really interesting legislation, with the goal here being with the goal of them being able to facilitate biotech industry growth and development inside of Montana primarily.
Controversial legislation.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit controversial. I did a post about it last year, and a lot of people had a lot of thoughts to share. But in particular, what this legislation allows you to do is if you make your therapy inside of Montana and you have phase 1 safety data, you can then sell it inside of Montana. I'm assuming both for, from what I understand, both for people who live in Montana, but also for anyone else who wants to come to Montana and get it. Now, the immediate concern there is, well, this is just going to be a bunch of snake oil. A bunch of different people are going to come along and make a bunch of random therapies and then just try to, make a quick buck off of it. And that is certainly a concern and one that we want to get into. But the primary thing we want to talk about today would be, how could you potentially use this lever? This is available. It's not going to be going anywhere. It's now a tool that's in the tool belt, regardless of whether we like it or not. And the question is going to be, how could we responsibly use this for the purposes of rare diseases? We've got a big problem inside of the rare disease space. I don't know if you guys have noticed. Funding is a little bit tight, and the standard way of making these drugs is now over $1 billion. There's over 10,000 rare diseases. We're not going to be able to do this for every single rare disease if the cost is $1 billion to get this into kids.
So Ben, was it the point of the legislation was for rare diseases, or was it just like to boom the Montana-based biotech?
Well, yeah, Dan, you can probably jump in here.
That's a really good question. And I think this is this is sort of an instance where you can look at the motivation behind these, enacting of these legislations. And also this is happening globally. We have Infinita City in Honduras with Prospera that is also really pushing for these very, very streamlined access to experimental therapies. The motivation to do this was really driven by a core of particularly, say, Silicon Valley billionaires who want access to longevity therapies. So we've all seen Brian Johnson's...
way more sense.
Yeah. Brian Johnson's documentary about, he's actually flying down to Prospera every month and getting injected with plasmid DNA that is expressing things like FGF12. So my take on this is that you can agree or disagree with the motivation behind this, and they've been very, very strong in going to these state legislatures and lobbying for this expanded right to try. But you don't really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because when you're in the rare and ultra-rare disease space, you can look at this and say, the structure that they're trying to put in place, which will require pretty local, thorough review of those experimental drugs, validation of clinical sites, and you're going to have to build the infrastructure within those states. I say, let's piggyback off this, because they're going to pour money into this to validate these clinical sites. And really what we're looking at is something that could be unique in America because of the federal system. So we have federalism in America, and you have states' rights that provides the framework for doing this. We've seen it with marijuana legislation across states. And we have this huge unmet need that this is almost purpose-built to support. And I feel that patients who are in the rare and ultra-rare disease space, the majority end up being treated in clinical trials anyway, and there's just no strong commercial model. This isn't a $1 billion addressable market. So we need to have mechanisms like this that lower the barrier of access. The challenge is to go to the legislatures and to do this in a structured, safe, and thoughtful way. And we need partners to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been involved in the rare disease community for a long time, and the principle of right to try is something that I support, because so many of these families have no options. And in rare disease, there's about 15 million U.S. children with a rare disease. A third of them are going to die by age 5, and so. We have to figure out ways that we can make more accessible to these children therapies that may have a chance of working in them. I think what I worry about a little bit with the Montana policy specifically is you're only requiring someone to get through safety testing. So, these are complex genetic diseases often treated with gene or cell therapies, which are also complex and which can have, considerations of maybe the safety signal doesn't show up right away, it shows up later. And, if you're taking advantage of a family's desperation and saying, come here, do this, this will work, but there's no efficacy data required, it's, potentially not been, you may have arrived at a safe dose, but you don't know if that dose is going to be effective for that patient, and a patient chooses that route, that will probably exclude them from participating in another clinical trial that may be for a more effective approach to treating that disease if they're fortunate enough to have one.
I also feel like it would be a nightmare to get payers on board with this, because what kind of insurance company is going to want to pay, $1 million?
That creates some equity issues, right? Because you've got billionaires that can want, are pursuing this kind of approach for longevity purposes, but these families oftentimes are Medicaid,
right?
They, as it is, have to give up often their jobs to just take care of their children. And now you're saying, okay, well, only the ones that can afford to get to Montana for some of these complex therapies, you might have to live in proximity of a treatment center for 3 to 4 months. So give up everything, come to Montana, and take a treatment if you can pay it out of pocket for something that we don't know if it's going to be efficacious or not. So I think there's some, question marks there. I wish that the standard had maybe gone a little bit farther into efficacy. I wish that it was somehow tied to, national, more vetted national standards around, what constitutes something that right to try should apply to.
I mean, I think this is also where it's critical as we think about how you could implement this for rare and ultra-rare disease and advanced therapies, gene and cell therapies, is that you have to involve the patients, the families, and the foundations with the legislatures now. To go there and make the case. We do understand that they're probably more risk tolerant than a lot of your average patients, and to talk about reimbursement, most of these will never get commercialized, and will never. I mean, this is, really why Craig is so focused on getting these through the clinical trial development cycle. But the truth is, right now, there is no path to commercialization for them that is effective. So, in a reimbursement, people are looking at paying out of pocket or self-funding clinical trials. The research foundations, I don't really like it where you have to rely on private money or fundraising, but it gives them an option outside of just continuing to fund through clinical trials where they can support some of that cost to the patient that paying out of pocket. And one thing that I think would also be important, and very similarly to where you see drug developers going abroad to China, now to Australia and other jurisdictions for their first-in-human clinical trials, can be run in parallel with FDA-approved IND and through to phase 2. But what you're already doing is you're generating your first-in-human safety data. You can move to efficacy with the conventional mechanism, but you're also, within that state, having the beginnings of a revenue stream that could sort of lower that economic barrier. But we need the support and the input from the families, the patients. They're the most experienced and some of the most informed people for their own indications.
So yeah, if I can interject here, right? So if we're really thinking about just, obviously there's lots of concerns here, but the question is, how could we potentially make something like this work in a way that, yes, it's probably going to be something that's paid out of pocket, but is there a mechanism by which that cost would be low enough that it's not unrealistic for that to be like almost like a GoFundMe, like a crowdfund where, instead of it being $500,000 you've got to raise, it's 50. And so I think that would be something that would be interesting to talk about just with regards to like what that could look like. So if it's okay, can I just give a little bit of a framework for what this could look like?
Yep.
And then get some thoughts.
Here we go.
Knock us out the park, Ben.
Here's the
It's called
soapbox.
Ben's basement.
Realistically, I think what this could potentially do is if we as an industry are interested in potentially utilizing this in a responsible way that would ultimately benefit patients, what we could potentially do, right, is to have some sort of consortium of industry partners, regulator partners, rare disease families who would kind of oversee and give like some sort of stamp of approval to certain therapies. And this is how you eliminate snake oil and people who would be trying to just benefit from this for personal gain. You would probably have to start with saying, in order for you to even be considered for this like designation or whatnot, or just like even approval for like that you're not snake oil, you've got to have either a family member or someone with the disease has to be in leadership at that company, at this rare disease foundation, or someone with a very close tie with someone who has that disease. That's kind of one of the pre-qualifications. That way, anyone who's going to be developing a therapy has a vested interest in it being as high quality and as safe as possible and ideally efficacious. And I can see the smirk, so I'm looking forward to getting a little bit of pushback here. What that would ideally be able to do then is if you went and developed this therapy in Montana, you are incentivized to make something that's going to be reliable and safe. You get to that point, you are able to enroll your child or your family member in that initial phase 1 safety clinical trial. But since you're not a large pharma or you're not VC backed, ideally this is something that you would be able to raise money on for yourself if the costs for getting to that point can be made relatively low. You are now in a position where, since you're not incentivized to charge $1 million a dose for this, you would be in a position to then sell that therapy at cost. So ideally your costs to get to the point where you can sell it are low, but since you are a rare disease foundation, you are incentivized as well. You're not interested and you're not primarily driven by profit, but the goal here is just to make it something that the 50 other people inside of the states can get access to, and that's kind of it. And you only get this like special designation where like a consortium of experts have kind of looked it over and said, our recommendation is this is pretty safe, and they've kind of gotten our approval that they're not looking to just make a quick buck. They're committed to this being something that can be provided at cost to patients, since it's a rare disease foundation that's kind of leading it. Feel free to tear me apart here, guys.
Yeah, so I mean, a few concerns with that approach. There's a lot of talk about patient-led drug development. There's a lot of talk about patient centricity and how important that is, and I believe that. But there are a lot of foundations that have wandered into drug development with no expertise and knowledge and have made some mistakes.
Bad decisions.
And, the investment goes into an area of therapeutic approach that isn't likely to work in that disease. And in other instances, because the way in which they've advanced a therapy, makes it much more complex in terms of a regulatory submission. And so, sometimes a little bit of dispassionate oversight is maybe preferential to having an effort led by a patient or a caregiver, because, out of the best of intentions, they may make some mistakes. I think the other piece of this is I would actually approach it from more of a capitalistic perspective, because you're not going to scale if you're having to raise money with bake sales or whatever for every single therapy that is being administered. If you adopt a model, so we have a cost plus model, and what we try and do is look objectively at how do we bring down the costs as much as possible for that last mile of development, and then cost of goods and things like that, but still account for what's it going to take to be sustainable. And there are other factors that come into play that don't often get priced into a therapy, like long-term follow-up, and other post-marketing commitments that you would have to make. In this case, you're dealing with therapies that haven't been proven effective. So you also are going to have pretty hefty insurance and other liability that you're going to have to take on. If you approach it in more of a commercial way and you have it operate somewhat in parallel to where federal regulation is going. So you could look at like the plausible mechanism pathway and figure, okay, well, this is a therapeutic approach that has been proven in a disease area that it gives me some sense, is going to work in this one as well. And not operate kind of out in the wild frontier without, any grounding in what's typically required of a therapy.
I really agree with that, and I think that another factor that comes into where you're sort of we very much need the patient and the research foundation input. What you will find is, like, particularly for some of these more aggressive terminal pediatric diseases, their risk tolerance is exceptionally high. So they are often desperate. So, like, the safety profile could be significantly lower than really if you're looking at IRB or a sort of an independent evaluation of that, that they probably wouldn't approve that. I think one of the other things, again, looking at the economic model, is to go back to the premise of why these expanding right to tries were started. We said this is coming from a cohort of very, very wealthy individuals who want access to experimental therapies for not the indications that we're talking about. So the framework that is being set up in places like Honduras and in now looking in Florida, Idaho, New Hampshire, but they're building out the infrastructure to support that. And really what you want to look at is what should they be paying? And what's the tax incentive there? A lot of what they have lobbied to Montana is about economic redevelopment. And particularly when you look at the therapies, if we're looking at advanced therapies like gene therapies, it's likely you will have to manufacture them in Montana because of interstate commerce laws. So really, the Montana and the states that are setting this up should be developing tax base coming from these experimental therapies, from the manufacturers that are going to go build. They want to incentivize them to be there, but you also want to use that to have state funds that when we come to rare, ultra rare, and a significant unmet need, are going to discount and support that through these clinical sites, because overall it's going to benefit the economy of Montana. So there has to be state incentives and a program that could be comparable to Medi-Cal that is going to provide a state support for children that are going to die.
And I think in many of these states, we have to look at some different alternatives. So, the origination of Right to Try was really around terminally ill patients, not around these billionaire, longevity seekers. And that's really the mindset that we should be thinking about with respect to Right to Try for rare diseases, because while not all of these children or patients might be terminally ill, many of them are facing really devastating and fast-moving rare diseases without a very good prognosis if there is no treatment. But I think within those states, many is the state that's invested billions in biohubs that are now struggling. And so if a state isn't committed to the long-term growth and sustainability of that sector in that state, and if they're not viewed as being a credible hub for that type of innovation, they're going to struggle, and they're going to struggle to get investment. You look at a market like Montana, as lovely as I'm sure Montana is, most of the successful biohubs have at least three things present in numbers. Premier biomedical institutions, access to diverse patient populations, and venture capital. I am not
Montana doesn't
sure
have any of
any of
those.
those things exist in Montana. And so, this is a challenge. And, coming into it and saying if we build it, they will come and it will be sustainable. That's
The thought is good.
the thought is great.
In practice, it's going to be difficult. What do you think? I'd love to hear your perspective on this. There are so many patients who are suffering and or dying from these rare diseases. What do you do with a disease of N of 15 in the country? Besides just like say, not
I
worth
think that's where you look to leverage market incentives. You look to take advantage of. So the priority review voucher, for example, has now been renewed.
renewed, right?
Finally. That creates an entirely different set of calculus around the development of a drug for an ultra-rare disease population. It may not make it sufficiently lucrative for, Pfizer to develop a drug, but it's plenty lucrative for, a mid-tier for-profit biotech or for, biotechs from other countries that are looking to have entry in the U.S. and want a quick win. So I think there's still ample opportunity within the system we have, especially looking at some of the incentives and that we have from a tax and PRV perspective, along with what we're seeing out of FDA now in terms of their recognition that rare disease is different.
Sure.
And their ability to consider plausible mechanism, accelerated review, different sets of standards, which is kind of where you want to be. The different set of standard that doesn't include any efficacy testing
Right.
is,
A little bit, dial it up a little bit more.
But if you can do a phase 1-3 trial, I heard about one company the other day that's their FDA is permitting them to use publications as the control arm.
Where was that?
Oh, I can't
Montana?
say who it was, but it wasn't in Montana. But I think what it recognizes is that, in these disease areas, obviously there's a need to move fast, move efficiently, and I'd almost prefer to use the tools we have in place with the institutions out there that have great experience with these types of therapies, rather than the wild, wild west. And I agree with the spirit of the approach. It's exactly what we need to do more of. And I like the creativity of saying, okay, well, actually, if you manufacture a product in a state and the patient is treated in the state, we don't need the FDA. But in reality, companies aren't going to come in there with their therapy because where are the IP protections and where's the opportunity for us to then maybe commercialize that same approach in other therapeutic areas? So, you got to get the innovation in there in the first place.
Right.
And then you have to do it in a way that's protective of patients. And, I'm a little skeptical the way it's structured now that it adequately does that.
Sure.
And I think, again, it also is, working with the existing framework. Again, we're looking at really lowering the cost of manufacturing. If you can effectively go from, the commercial model being where you need $1 billion addressable market to have the margin that is going to justify, commercialization for pharma, where you can have a tenfold reduction in that, and so suddenly you're down at like 100,000, addressable market, or even, $1 million addressable market, 500 million. You're getting to economics that are going to make sense, and that's really going to require the adoption of the new technologies, not just in manufacturing where we're focused, but as we look at cell and gene therapies, there's innovations that are really critical for improving safety, dramatically lowering dose in gene therapies. We look at engineered capsids in particular for AAV, and improving potency on target, reducing off-target effects. We need this sort of holistic approach. We can look at the federal legislation. The FDA is recently saying for certain ultra-rare diseases, from a CMC perspective, is you could potentially go into patients without having a GMP product. And you have a much more streamlined regulatory interaction. And there's models outside of the US where we have this idea of local review. Australia is a really good model where effectively, if your IRB review at the local level, if you want to treat a patient in Sydney and you're coming out of CHMRI with an experimental therapy, that's reviewed locally. The difficulty there is also what we may run into in places like Montana, is the patients can you bring patients into a jurisdiction? That's really difficult. If they're coming globally, if they're coming from other places in Australia, you need to somehow fund that. But there's a dramatic reduction in the sort of regulatory burden and the speed at which to get into a phase 1. So we have to see this as a tool in a toolbox. And understanding how we can implement it without, again, closing doors nationally or internationally and de-incentivizing drug developers because they see a risk in going to Montana or elsewhere. That's really where the devil is in the details. But there are models outside the US that could be particularly applied on a state-by-state basis because we have the federalism structure that would allow safe review into phase 1. And then really the conversation now is about what should be the bar for then allowing the companies to charge for these drugs after that, you know.
Yeah, and I totally agree. There's a lot of other good examples in other markets, around regulatory flexibility and efficiency. The UK point of care manufacturing, things like that, where you're sort of approaching and commercializing a therapy almost in the same way you would have a perpetual IND, and so I think there are some approaches like that that can work, particularly for nano-rare and N of 1 type conditions where there may only be one center and every patient goes there.
Right.
So I guess the question would be then, right, given that this legislation is available in Montana and increasingly in other states, in what circumstances would this be a good tool to pull out of the toolbox?
Personally, I think when there is a center of excellence based in that state for treatment, so you have clinicians that know how to treat those diseases with those types of therapies, and when the line is edged up from phase 1 to some demonstration of clinical efficacy. And, I think then it's a matter of, have you set up an infrastructure in such a way where you can sustain the level of manufacturing standards that are going to be needed over time, and maybe put in place some sort of funding mechanism whereby when patients are treated, a portion of the revenues from that treatment goes into a fund that will allow access for patients who otherwise, if they're not paying out of pocket, are never going to get access to those treatments. And in Montana, I think they put like a 2%, thing in there, which that's going to fund a cup of coffee around the treatment center. But something really meaningful like that, where maybe there's some sort of risk pooling amongst the payers, or something to make the economics of it so that it's more accessible to patients who don't have billions of dollars and can't.
So what is the standard way that, this is a question out of ignorance, what is the standard way that these rare diseases get like through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials? You mentioned that a lot of patients get treated in clinical trials.
They often don't. That's the reality, and that's why we have patient advocates setting up PBCs, we have self-funding. Most of these do not get commercialized. There just simply isn't the economic incentive, and the current pharma structure, biotech structure, does not allow for that if you have such a small patient population. And that's why we sort of look at these sort of a little bit out of left field ideas, but they have to be done safely. So self-funding or foundations or biotechs raising through public-private money to get phase 1, phase 2, but oftentimes they're going to die before they even get to registrational studies.
And is this like a relatively recent, like a problem of modernity, where it's like before we didn't really know? The idea of like our awareness of these ultra-rare genetic diseases has to be a relatively new phenomenon, right?
Well, we're discovering these diseases at 10 times the rate that new drugs are being approved, right? So that's one challenge, is the hole keeps getting deeper for these 10,000 rare diseases for which there is no treatment. I think what's happened in recent years is that the business model for developing a rare disease drug has always been pretty tenuous, right? But some of the incentives that had been put into place through the Orphan Drug Act in 1983 and since have been eroded. And when things like the priority review voucher wasn't extended in 2024,
Right.
If you're an investor, you're looking at net present value. You're thinking,
Never going to happen.
this doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
And some of the elements of the Inflation Reduction Act and other things brought uncertainty into the market. And uncertainty is not a good thing when you're doing drug development.
Right.
So I think, some of those are starting to get restored. And one area of uncertainty was regulatory, that, we're starting to see some more rationality to what they're doing.
Right.
And I think those things are gonna help.
So I guess for you, Craig, if you were to wave a magic wand, and you've got this legislation is a tool in the toolbox. You've got there's now an increased standard where you've got the efficacious factor. Under what circumstances would you say, hey, here's a rare disease family that's highly motivated. They want to build this therapy. Under what circumstances, if there's a center of excellence inside of the state as well, under what circumstances would this be a good tool to use, as opposed to being like, well, you can try to raise some money and get to an IND. It's going to take you like 4 or 5 years, and you got to have a lot of money, and you might get a PRV at some point, but also there's a boatload of these rare disease therapies that just never get commercialized anyway. Like, at what point do we use something like this? It seems, for the most part, the existing model isn't working super well.
Yeah, and look, it's hard not to say I'll try it, and I don't want to say if I were in that situation I wouldn't. I just think there's a lot of potential for it to go the wrong way. I would say that the magic wand would be better alignment between payers, so state Medicaid programs, and these types of models, so that it doesn't preclude access, and so that an innovator is more incentivized to actually bring that innovation into that market to be tried. And if there is some demonstration of efficacy in that environment, then that therapeutic all of a sudden starts to look more valuable.
Makes sense, right?
And I think that from a federal level and from a funding level, we've actually seen movement toward, I think, around the regulatory, but also around putting, say, federal funds into the development of advanced therapies and precision genetic medicines, where there's a real push to try and streamline them. And one of the good examples of that recently is the ARPA-H Thrive initiative, where not only is it a focus on developing advanced and precision medicines that are platformable, so this again speaks to technology that can actually lower the barrier from a safety, efficacy, and a regulatory viewpoint, but an expectation that the drug developers are going to work hand in hand with the research foundations. So every precision genetic medicine that would be developed under that program, you have to be working with a research foundation.
Right.
And the idea here is to get to a BLA where your initial clinical trials for one PGM on one indication is going to provide that platformable data that is going to de-risk your follow-on programs. And they can be, it's the same biologic drug. You're looking at how you can modularize it, swap out payloads, and that then allows the much more rapid regulatory review to commercialization for follow-on programs.
That's the dream, right?
And well, what I like about that model is it's also got a module 3 which says, and
Exactly.
what's the sustainable commercial model that goes along with this? And I think that's where more of those types of initiatives are needed, because it's one thing to fund something to get into a clinical trial. It's another thing to make sure that ultimately gets to patients in some sustainable way.
And that's, if you're successful in developing something like a predictable AV therapy that can be applied across a range of indications, then shortcutting that regulatory path to, from a review, from 5 to 10 years down to like 2 or 3 years to get to registration on BLA. This is not an either or. I think this is an and you really need to harmonize what's being done in these states with changes to the federal legislation that means that it really is incentivizing developers and de-risking it for them.
Yep.
Makes sense. Okay, well, so yeah, if we were just kind of given like a TLDR here at the end, maybe I can get both of you to give like a 30-second recap here. With regards to this kind of legislation, what are your thoughts? Where can we use it? Just kind of as a recap before we wrap up here.
I mean, given everything we've talked about, and you're talking about what is the ideal phenotype of if we are going to go ahead with this and we're going to do it on a state-by-state basis, we're here in California, right? Montana, I understand how they were lobbied to sort of pass this bill, and it squeaked by 1 vote, and we still have to see how their HHS actually implements it. But I think Craig outlined what would be the phenotype of that environment to do this properly. And I would like to see it in California because we have the centers of excellence, we have the diversity, we have the patient population, and we have the state infrastructure to actually provide incentives through Medi-Cal and through other programs like that, and CIRM, that would really allow this to be done in a way that supports the patient, provides equity, but has the technical sophistication, the clinical site sophistication that would really say, we believe this can be done safely. So some of it is site selection.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that, you don't want to be discriminatory about what states should and should not be able to do this, but I think if you're looking at it practically and you're looking at it from the perspective of what's best for patients, it is really going to be those places where they have the expertise to do this, they're willing to be innovative about it, but also to hold to certain standards that will make sure that those treatments are really going to help patients.
Very good. Excellent. Well, thank you to you both. Well, I guess maybe Jeff, do you have any additional thoughts there?
I just like the idea. I mean, I know that it's a pipe dream, but the idea of having a standard, like for genetic therapies at least, like a standard way of like gene replacement and gene knockout, and then just like flapping in and out payloads. But I get that you change payloads, it changes the drug, and it just becomes the kind of thing where it's like everything that you think of, it's like, oh well, red tape, or biology is difficult, right? So.
It's not a pipe dream. I think there's many developers and technology developers are really working towards that. That's the idea of like, can we get a genetic therapy that's as platformable as a monoclonal? There's always going to be, but it's really if you have, and again, it may be for a subset of indications.
That's what I'm thinking.
Maybe
Yeah,
neuromuscular, or it may be like lysosomal storage diseases.
Right.
But I think we will get there. But it does require this adoption of the innovative technologies because the modularity is there. If you're basically repurposing an engineered capsid and you're able to hot swap out a payload, and you know exactly everything about the biodistribution, the immune reaction, the dose, the potency, and you can start doing umbrella clinical trials with you can have these multi-indication outcomes. So you can have very carefully designed clinical trials coupled with plausible mechanism and platform designation. The idea is we can get there.
Yeah, that sounds like the best option for me, especially with these genetic diseases.
And I think once you have that, you're going to be able to directly commercialize out of academic medical institutions.
Right.
Because they'll have a whole, portfolio
right
on
there.
the same platform that are, waiting in line behind that first approval. And that'll help bring the cost down too, in all likelihood.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for, especially Craig, rather short notice. Appreciate you being willing to share your expertise and bring my high aspirations back down to reality. So thank you so much, each of you, for coming, and thanks everyone for joining as well.